Okay, so welcome everybody. For those of you who don't already know me, I am Victoria Sutherland and I am Head of Evidence at the Local Economic Growth, and I'm going to chair today's event. This is the fifth in a series of workshops that the Government Cities and Local Growth Unit asked us to run, and really their purpose is to help local policymakers think about the key issues that they're going to face during the COVID-19 recovery phase. This session is slightly different to the previous four because they were all focused on a specific policy issue. So the first one was on green investment, then we looked at youth unemployment and scarring, high streets and working from home. This topic is much more cross-cutting. So we're going to look at monitoring and evaluation during the recovery. So I've spent my entire career working on monitoring and evaluation, and I think it's fair to say that it is always challenging to monitor and evaluate your projects and your programs. So, there's real practical questions about, where do you get the data that you need, how to decide what analysis you're going to do, figuring out how best to communicate the results of your monitoring and evaluation, but also there's often real challenges in terms of getting buy-in from the rest of your organisation to just doing the monitoring and evaluation. But I think it's fair to say that COVID-19 has thrown up all sorts of additional challenges, and hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on what to do about them in today's session. There's also another challenge, which is not about monitoring and evaluation your interventions, so your projects and your programs, but monitoring your local economy. So this is something that perhaps we're less used to doing. We perhaps have an idea of the underlying strengths and weaknesses, what our industrial base looks like as a local area. But actually, COVID has forced lots of us to be thinking about the economy on a kind of week by week and month by month basis that perhaps we didn't do in the past. So that's another challenge that we're going to touch on today. So I don't know, when myself and Henry Overman, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, were talking about this yesterday, I kind of joked that we've called it monitoring and evaluation during the recovery, but we should really have called it monitoring and evaluation, because there's both the monitoring of the economy and the monitoring of your projects. So as in the previous sessions, we have a guest speaker. So I'm really pleased to welcome Rebecca Riley, who is Head of Research and Office for Data Analytics at the West Midlands Combined Authority. And she's also closely involved in West Midlands Ready and is chair of the Green Book user group. She also has been working in economic development for a very long time. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Beck. That sounds like it's rude, but I mean it as a compliment. So I think one of the things that Beck will talk about is a little bit about how what they were able to do in West Midlands built on what she'd done in the Northwest Development Agency under the financial crisis that we had in 2007-8. So that knowledge and expertise that kind of allowed them to get up and running very quickly. After Rebecca, our director, Professor Henry Overman, will then respond, setting out some of his thoughts about what is it that we should be thinking about in relation to monitoring and evaluation at the local level at the current time. And in part, he will draw on our Using Data to Inform Decision-Making paper that we published earlier in the year. And I really encourage people to read that. And at some point when I'm not talking, what I'll do is I'll put the link to it in the chat function so that everyone can access that. And then what we'll do is we will open up for questions and comments and reflections. So what I would ask is, if you have a question, please pop it in the chat, and then what I'll do is I will call on you, to ask your question of Rebecca and Henry. But one of the things I'd say is, in the previous sessions, the ones that I would say worked best were those where actually local areas perhaps reflected some of their learning with each other. So Rebecca and Henry are happy to take questions, but we'd also be really interested to kind of hear about your experience, and in particular what challenges you're maybe facing. Because I think it's useful to air them, and other people may have, solutions. we've put the session in for 90 minutes, but what we always try to do is we try to finish in about 75 minutes. I think claiming back 50 minutes is always a lovely thing to do, but I think in this slightly hybrid world that we're all living in, it's an especially useful thing at the moment. So we're scheduled to finish at 3, but I'm going to aim for us to finish at 2:45. So that's it. So I am going to hand over to Rebecca, who hopefully will be able to share her screen because I know she has some slides.
Hopefully everybody can see that. So just a little bit of, I suppose, some background in terms of what we've got in the West Midlands, because we've got a relatively unique situation when it comes to monitoring, evaluation and research and data, in that we've got a structure in the region that brings together all the local authorities, the LEPs, and the universities and the growth company and the chambers as well into a structure that allows us to share data. We've got collaboration agreements in place, and that's on the back of the development of a programme called West Midlands Regional Economic Development Institute, WMReady, which is funded by the UKRI RED Fund. So we've got central government funding through the research councils to develop a structure in the West Midlands that can help us do better evidence evaluation and data. So we probably had an advantage to some other areas because we'd already put this in place before the pandemic, admittedly not long before the pandemic, but that was in place as a partnership. And it allowed us to work a lot more collaboratively and a lot more quickly than other places might have been able to do. I suppose the first sort of thing I'm going to look at then is this idea and concept around monitoring, and I suppose Victoria is correct. It's monitoring as well, in terms of we put in place very rapidly a process of looking at how do we rapidly respond as a network of organisations to potential impacts that might happen, and as she pointed out, it was useful that I'd gone through this in 2008-9, that I'd been through that process. It was also useful, I think, looking back, that I used to sit on the regional resilience group. So a lot of the work and understanding of that was already I'd already been through it. And I'd also, slightly randomly in that sense, I'd also done monitoring under SARS and bird flu. And looking at where outbreaks were, and as part of the regional resilience work, we'd already done modelling about what would happen if some of the risks that happened, what effects it might have. So I'd already done some of that mapping previously, and one of the biggest lessons from that process was actually getting people together that would have a lot of tacit qualitative knowledge together, because a lot of the data that's published isn't just not quick enough. So you have to have real on the ground knowledge. So we brought those people together, and I sort of galvanized people behind doing a weekly economic monitor. That feeds directly into the Mayor's Economic Intelligence Group, which right from the beginning of March was meeting weekly. So we developed these monitors, and I subsequently lost my Wednesday evenings for 18 months. But the whole process was to bring together information that people had. That was the LEPs, the business support. There was an awful lot of support. And one thing I would reflect on actually is that it really did show up the fact that there is a lack of research intelligence data and evaluation skills across the board. And the pockets of real expertise, such as Black Country Consortium and their Economic Intelligence Unit, who have kept hold of that capacity, has been really key to being able to respond quickly. So we did those monitors. We used a mix of research that was coming out of academia, research that was coming out of our partners, stuff that was going through growth hubs in terms of what businesses were saying, and pulled that together and made sure that it got into the mayor's group, and it's sort of a weekly agenda item that is presented, and the big issues are sort of directed through that group, and that allows the mayor to make decisions. It allows the organisations within the region, and we have businesses on that as well, to make decisions about what they might want to do. So it's quite good. We did evaluate this process, and we evaluated the monitor. Overwhelmingly, what was interesting is that how people get hold of it, and how people outside of the region are using it, because it was a good resource, and also how they're using it internally to brief their own organisations, because we don't just, we cover the national, global picture, and then how that applies to the West Midlands, so that makes it useful for other people. This process also fed into, we do a State of the Region report. We're on our 5th one now, and the last two, obviously 2019 and 2020, were very much dominated by the impacts of COVID, and I think it's a balancing act then between how do you understand the long-term issues versus the short-term impacts, and how do you balance those things off, and actually how do you keep everybody's eye on the ball of the long term, because the danger is that you all shift to the short-term reactive stuff, and that was the purpose of the State of the Region, was to make sure that we keep on track with thinking beyond, you know, the next week, next month, next year, next 3 or 5 years. So those two processes have helped us do that, and combining what we knew in the monitor and also that stock take, we came up with these 5 challenges which everybody in the region is now buying into, and it's driving a lot of strategy, including plan for growth, etc., in terms of how we do that activity. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of projects that we've had ongoing through this process, because I think it highlights sort of different approaches, different issues that we've tackled and faced in terms of evaluation. So the first one is a project called Pivot and Prosper, and the whole idea about this project was it was a rapidly developed programme. Within a matter of weeks, they pulled together the funding within GBS LEP to look at how can we help businesses to adapt to the issues that are coming out. So it was about new ways of working, building resilience, launching new products, services, but actually it was quite open, which, because there wasn't as much restriction on it that other funding programs might have, GBS LEP were allowed to respond very quickly. The interesting thing with this program as well is that there was a whole new type of business applying. So there were businesses that had never applied for funding before. So what our evaluation did, it was a very realist evaluation. So we were brought in early doors, and we were doing this through the process of this delivery, and it was a pilot scheme. But what our evaluation found was that there was a lot more hand-holding from the LEP in terms of helping them fill forms in. The businesses were massively appreciative of that, because it helped businesses that before the pandemic were successful. So we had a good example of one business that created cardboard cutouts, essentially for retail, the sort of things that you see in aisles. And that business just went overnight because they all went out of supermarkets. And there was a crisis around the supply chain on cardboard. So the funding allowed them to pivot so that their cutting machines could be changed towards cutting out plastic. And they started cutting out visors for businesses, and specifically the NHS, to protect our NHS workers. So that was a good example of how, and in the long term, they've got a more diverse machinery and capital build there. It was a successful programme. The evaluation showed what worked within that, and it also showed the potential impacts, especially around saving jobs, because that was the main issue with this, is how do we stop these businesses collapsing because of pandemic impacts. And actually it's now being rolled out regionally to the other 3 LEPs. So that's a good example of something that was set up. It was a programme that was set up. We deliberately introduced a realist evaluation approach, because, you know, how can you do some of the more complicated modelling? It just wouldn't happen in that scenario. And then we've also got a we're also done an evaluation, which is one of the employment support pilots. And I can't go into the details because it's not been released yet, but I can talk about some of the issues that we faced in terms of delivering that, because this program was set up way before the pandemic. It was a 3-year program. So we had our whole evaluation program mapped out, how we were going to do it, what we were going to do, how we were going to work with the delivery bodies, etc. And actually the pandemic threw that basically into chaos. Not only the delivery, but our evaluation, because a lot of the methods that we'd set out just would not work. So we had this issue of switching from physical evaluation to online, which can mean that it's more time consuming, but you can reach a wider range of participants. There's challenges also speaking to partner organisations, because all of a sudden these training providers that were offering the employment support, they were deluged with people off either on furlough or on or actually with COVID. So we had real problems getting hold of people. And actually the nature of support and the provision changed dramatically from the beginning to through the end, mainly because of this physical support. You couldn't do great group-based work, etc., which then means you have to change the way you're evaluating to make sure it's a fair evaluation, because obviously you can't evaluate on what they originally set out to do. So those were some of the methodological issues that we faced in evaluation. And I suppose in the lessons that we learned from that was, I think, the real need to think creatively about how you engage with relevant interviewees. So where did people still go? Where could we find them when we were talking to them about the employment support that they'd have? We needed to think about how that support was changing, and it was changing in response to the requirements at that time, i.e. there was more mental health support provided, which wasn't envisaged at the beginning. We actually had to completely revisit the theory of change because of the circumstances. So the main elements in the programme actually diminished quite a bit, and we ended up with very different focus in terms of especially dealing with people that might be facing furlough. And that's an interesting one, because if you're on furlough, what can you access? What can you develop? Because there are all sorts of rules and restrictions around that. We also needed to consider whether changing some circumstances actually result in a changed profile of participants, much like the Pivot and Prosper, where we had good examples of very successful businesses facing huge business model challenges. Individuals were. So all of a sudden, we've seen it in the West Midlands, and I'm sure it's in most places. You had people where, particularly women who had increased care responsibilities. So all of a sudden you've got to look after your children, you've got to look after your elderly parents, you've got adult social care issues if you're looking after somebody with mental health or disability, whereas they might have been free because they had support. Now that was all gone. So we had a problem with that in terms of the types of people that this type of employment support program would look to help were all of a sudden not available and not open to doing that. And also the actual jobs that they would have normally gone into were disappearing. So less retail, less arts and cultural stuff, but actually in other areas it was booming. So retail and health and social care. So we had not only did the programme have to think again about where did it target, but we had to, in terms of, again, looking back at which sectors they might be targeting. And I think finally, in terms of impact, we needed to take account of any changes in the nature of the project and the programme that was being delivered. And that included the administrative processes within that. So were payments to providers changing? So that was one thing. So if you were structured to deliver, could you actually meet the numbers? Therefore, did that affect the number of the amount of income that you got as a provider because you weren't meeting your numbers? So there was all that sort of upheaval that happened And actually, as one of the interesting things with this, we ended up within the research and the evaluation focusing a lot on the circumstances of the provider, not just the individual receiving the employment support, or the combined authority who administers this funding, and it's a DWP pilot, but actually the providers themselves were going through huge change. So how do you deal with that in evaluation terms, and how do you deal with the fact that their own business models are rapidly changing? So there's a lot of interesting findings in this report, and it's with DWP at the moment for publication. But the interesting thing about this is how all the different parts of the puzzle had to change and adapt and adopt new ways of working within this program, which is a challenge in itself in terms of evaluation from the point of view of, what did you start doing? What did you end up doing? There's no clear linear path anymore in some of these evaluations that might involve, the COVID years. And I suppose that's my main reflections, really. I suppose the problem is within this environment, I think everybody just has to do the best they can. And a lot of this is about informing your next decision, and trying to develop programs and policies that are reactive and take on board the change as it's happening.
Thank you, Beck. That was excellent. And I think, I suspect Henry's about to echo that point about, being realistic and, not holding yourself to too high a standard in terms of what we do. I think what was really interesting about what you were talking about was that you had two projects there. One where it was a project that was already on the books, it was already running pre-COVID, and then COVID hit. Whereas the other one was designed in response to COVID and had to get up and running very quickly. And I think that's really interesting because I think those two scenarios create different challenges for monitoring and evaluation. Whilst we've framed this as being about monitoring and evaluation and recovery, you're going to be monitoring and evaluating different things that started pre-COVID, things that started during COVID, and then there'll be a whole raft of things that will start, in coming, months that we need to think about the monitoring of it. So I think that's, that's a really good insight, I guess. I'm going to hand over to Henry to respond, and then we'll take questions. So I don't have any questions yet. So if anyone wants to ask Rebecca or Henry a question, remember to put it in the chat box, and then I will call on you later on to ask the question. But please do, stick them in there if you've got things you want to ask. Henry.
Yes. Well, I mean, Victoria keyed up the fact that I'm going to repeat, I think, some of the messages that we've had from Rebecca. And then, I'm not going to take too long because I'm really interested to hear about what people's experiences are. So let me start with the monitoring recovery question rather than, M&E of specific programs. I mean, Rebecca sort of talked about the scope that they had for doing stuff in the West Midlands and the fact that in some ways, they were sort of better resourced and and sort of further along in this process than others. Our approach on this, on using data to inform decision making, which you can read through the link that Victoria will have posted, I sort of came at this in the other direction, which was saying, well, let's imagine that actually, you were not particularly well resourced and didn't have a huge amount of spare capacity to do this because people were getting pulled onto all kinds of other things. What would you do? We sort of came up with the fact that at the point when we were writing this, we thought there were probably three things that we really felt you would want to know about and that it was feasible to get data on in a relatively low cost manner. So in some ways, I think of this as our recommendations for sort of minimum viable product. And our minimum viable product recommendation was many places will need to know something about mobility. I mean, this was particularly for urban areas, which had faced such a significant drop-off in their central city economy as a result of working from home. We felt that being able to track mobility was going to be very important for understanding what was happening in terms of working from home effects and impact on the central economy. So that was one thing, and we talk about a variety of ways of doing this. Again, I will be interested to hear about people's experience. The second thing we thought, the second part that we thought would really be necessary for, the sort of minimal approach to this is to look at what was going on in the labour market. Again, we knew with the furlough scheme, with the lockdowns, that there were large impacts on unemployment, large impacts on people that were furloughed, technically in employment, but not working. And we thought that this would be important to track and was an area where, the data would allow us to do it. The third thing that we put was COVID-19 rates and vaccinations. There's been some discussion here. This is a fingers crossed moment. I feel I should touch some wood while I say this. Maybe this is less important now than it was when we were writing this sort of 6 or 8 months ago, and I really, really hope that continues to be the case. So, I don't want to take the blame for things going south. So I'm touching wood as I say this. I think it would probably be just slightly lower down my list of priorities than it was sort of 6-8 months ago when we were first looking at this. So I think that was the minimal set. Here was our sort of advice on how to do it. The data has definitely been messed up on the labour market side, and mobility. There's a couple of providers who do different things. So our feeling was that really, if you want an accurate picture of this, you've probably got to look at a couple of different data sets and indicators. As I've said, I can easily see that there are tons of things that are useful to review. The real challenge with this is the fact that local data may not be available. The other thing I think with reviewing too much is that in some ways, at least from an economic development perspective, I think we found that these were the two things that actually would feed into immediate decision making. And this will be a message that comes across here. When you're hit by a crisis, of course, there's a tendency to really want to understand what's happening to your local economy and think about, this. But actually, while it's understandable that people really want to know what's happening, the effort has to be on things that can actually feed back into decision making. And our feeling was that these were the two really key indicators for feeding back into decision making. Again, I'd be interested to hear other things that people have. And I think this is just to highlight, this is a different set of things that we would look at relative to thinking about long-term planning, where if you look at our local industrial strategy work, which, who knows what's happening with local industrial strategies, but I still think is relevant for thinking about some long-term type stuff. There we talk about, doing quite a lot more work to understand your local economy. So really what I'm talking about here is short-term indicators that I would be monitoring to inform decision-making. This sort of brings us on to the second point, which is now moving a little bit more towards more traditional M&E. But here I think our message is sort of similar, which is that as much as possible, we need to be thinking about where to focus our efforts in a world of COVID. Now, some of that I fully appreciate will not be things on which you have much local flexibility, because they will be about meeting funding requirements. And one of the messages that we have been Someone muted me. Am I back? Yeah, okay. One of the things that sort of messages that we've been taking back to government is to be thinking about, whether it makes sense to continue with all of the monitoring requirements that it might have put in place on schemes. But, at the moment, these things are a bit outside of local areas' control. But then the second part is, again, consistent with the message that I said about monitoring the recovery of the local economy, which is that I do think it's crucial here that our efforts are focused on monitoring efforts where we have local flexibility that really will generate insights about key decisions, e.g. whether to continue funding. Rebecca talked about it, so that's Rebecca's first example there, right, where they were sort of doing, I suppose, Rebecca, what I would probably call monitoring rather than evaluation, but at least it helped you inform a decision about continuing or expanding the funding on a particular stream, the fact that you were monitoring this. I mean, the other two things that I would just say on that is that I think that there's an interesting discussion to be had about whether we, how much bespoke work we need to be doing versus whether we can make use of existing resources in terms of data. And again, I'm interested to hear where people are on that. And the other thing is, and this is sort of comes back to the point I made on Rebecca's thing, look, where evaluation is impossible, I'm not a purist. I actually think good monitoring is better than bad evaluation. And COVID might well have changed the balance between some of these in terms of informing key decisions. Let me just say something about evaluation, because I do think it would be a pity if we see all evaluation that we might be doing at the local level disappearing. And certainly our experience as the What Works Centre is that pre-COVID, we were in a world where we were starting to see increased interest in the local area about doing impact evaluation. And for reasons that we completely understand, a lot of that interest has waned as people have had to switch to managing the crisis. But I think it would be disappointing if we lost that momentum totally, because I still think that this will be crucial for informing future decisions. So I just wanted to reflect on a couple of the challenges around evaluation, which also one of the first of which applies to monitoring, which is, some of the ONS and government surveys have had to be scaled back, adapted, cancelled in 2020, and that's going to cause issues. I think the plus side is that it's become really apparent that there are lots of new data sets from both the ONS and private sector providers that we can use to think about the impact of policies that we're doing in a way that we couldn't do before. So I think some of those new data sources will be useful for looking at additional outcomes. We've been doing that, for example, in our Eat Out to Help Out work, where we've been looking at, say, footfall, which we hadn't looked at before, or using other data sources to look at job vacancies. Others, I think, will be useful at least for controlling for differences in the extent to which your economy has been impacted. Let me just finish with another sort of point, which I think is going to be a really big issue for ongoing quantitative evaluations. And actually this cartoon here sort of picks it up, and was something that Victoria spotted our old head of evidence posting on the internet, which is that, every data table that we have from now on is going to have two massive sort of stars next to the data for 2020 and 2021 saying the data here is really messed up. And of course, this is going to make a really big have a really big impact for ongoing impact evaluations that we're trying to do. So there's going to be problems about selecting baseline years for things that we are doing, is it 19, 20, 21? Problems for selecting what is going on during the COVID period. I mean, COVID's a massive shock, but we know we've also got Brexit, which also, even without COVID, we'd probably have had hashes against, 2020 and 2021 data for understanding the impact of some of these things. So I think there are no real perfect solutions for solving this problem. The economy's been hit by a massive shock. I do think it emphasizes the importance of selecting some kind of reasonable comparison group, if we can, for impact evaluation. So in some ways, it's reinforced the message that we make. And that, I suppose, brings me to the sort of final set of challenges, which is that if we want to be able to select comparison groups, a big challenge is that we've rolled things out at such scale that we might not really know how businesses, individuals, places were selected into treatment and targeted, and that is something that we're going to need to do. The other thing that is a little bit outside of our space, but obviously Beck's picked up on this in her comments about, you know, talking to providers, etc. There will be new ways of working that mean that the program we're evaluating may no longer be exactly the same as the scheme that we were inputting before. So there we go. I think that's enough. Let's open it up for discussion. But I hope that's given us some food for thought on some of the challenges we're going to face.
Okay, great. Thank you, Henry. I suppose I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask the first question. Beck, I mean, what you've done in terms of monitoring the recovery, I think there's so much to admire in there. And I think I'm going to make this point in case other people haven't picked up on this. They do this really good thing, which is they do look at local trends and what's happening to local businesses, but they also do lots of really great summaries of things that have been published nationally or internationally. And I think it's in a sense, it's a really good resource for people even outside of the West Midlands. But the other thing that I think is really admirable about what you've done is this hasn't been data analysis for data analysis' sake. It's been really, really closely tied into decision making by the mayor and, you know, his cabinet. And I suppose I'm kind of interested in kind of how, you know, what you've been able to achieve because it's been so tied into decision making that you wouldn't have otherwise if the two processes had been more detached. And I suppose my other thing that I'm really interested in is how is this going to change and evolve over time? Because, you know, you got set up very quickly and you've done it consistently over a long time period. But kind of what is it that you're thinking, you know, you need to do for the next 6 months or the next 12 months?
Well, thankfully, we've gone to every 2 weeks rather than every week, so I get 2 Wednesdays back. I think that's partly because of the. In some ways, we had a bit of an interesting period over the summer, particularly, where not a lot changed, and actually, the problem now is, and just to pick up something that Henry said, the problem now is. What I think has happened is that now the Brexit impacts are now biting, and it's very difficult to pull apart whether it's COVID or it's Brexit. And actually, I think we will continue to need to be doing this monitoring because those two things are interacting, and Brexit is a structural change over the longer term. We still don't know how it will land. Especially for the West Midlands in terms of things like the automotive industry and so on. So I think we have to continue doing it, but it's also set some interesting expectations, and it's raised the importance and raised the game of research, intelligence, and evaluation. Okay. So it's interesting how having this has galvanised people to think about it, when I think we probably went through a period where it had dropped off the radar a bit, partly because of resources, because even though we've got we have got staff, it's nothing like the level of staff that was there sort of in the 2000s. So capacity, capability is really pulled back, and I think going forward, certainly my focus is how do we invest in officers in the region to be able to do this better and to apply this and improve their evaluation and data and monitoring. Because without that, how do we know that we're designing the right things in such an uncertain world, really? But so I think the impact it's had, it's been used multiple times in terms of funding. So I think we had the biggest Build Back Better deal. Because we could evidence it properly, and we understood not just moving on from the list, because we actually published our local industrial strategy, but we'd monitored that. We'd looked, there's some really good work that's been done in the region around impacts on sectors, which was then feeding what the mayor and the LEPs were asking for in terms of support. So I think it's become a bit of a almost a hamster wheel, but it's a good hamster wheel that I think will actually have longer term benefits in terms of capacity building, but we're still a long way off in terms of what's really needed.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people in the audience might know this, but I used to work at LEP, and I would echo that in terms of capacity, that it is a constant battle to secure resources. I suppose I'm interested in, people in the West Midlands clearly are bought into tracking the economy and how that's changing over time. Do you think that has translated into the more greater buy-in to the more traditional M&E, or do you think people see them as very different processes?
I think we've still got the age-old problem that people think evaluation is what you do at the end.
Yeah.
And they don't think about it up front. But that comes back to capacity and capability again, about knowledge and being able to do this. I mean, it does vary obviously by organisation, policy area, etc. Some policy areas that are used to doing very structured evaluations and monitoring, that's continued, but in other areas it's not. So I think we've still got the problems that we've always had. We still get people confusing outputs and outcomes. And
I think we'll have that forever.
I think we will have that forever. But at least I think what has actually happened, if there are positives out of this period, is that people have recognised the need to know what's going on and to act on it. And the better we can do that, and the more tools we can have, and the more skills that we can have in doing it, is all the better.
Actually, can I ask a question on this, Rebecca? So, is the employment support pilot the sort of closest you'd get to the kind of impact evaluation that we have a tendency, that we tend to try and support? I mean, there's not really control groups and stuff. I mean, I know the sort of work you've been doing there. I mean, is that the closest you'd probably get to that at the moment in the local growth space? I mean, I'm sure there's other things going on, like it was your comment that some of the places that are used to doing that, that are used to doing trials or whatever, there'll be sort of stuff in the health space, etc., which is probably, still doing, which does have that kind of emphasis on the control groups and stuff. But do you think that the employment support pilot is the closest that you've got? And then my follow-up to that was, I know you said the sort of report was with DWP, but do you have any reflections that you can share with us on what happened with, interviews, type of support, profile of participants, provider reflections, impact on it? I don't know how much you can share, but it would be, if that's the closest you've got, I think it would be interesting to hear your experiences.
I mean, what I would say is that generally, as you say, there's some areas that have stuck with the more traditional way of doing evaluations, etc. And I think the skills area is one of those where skills and employment support has continued in that vein. I think just like you mentioned earlier about data and surveys being cut back at a national level, I think the requirement to deliver rapidly investment to help businesses at such a pace, I think it'll be a while before a good evaluation is done anywhere on that, to be honest, in terms of how do you go back and what do you do and what's your baseline, etc. I mean, the interesting thing with the Pivot and Prosper, because we were interviewing businesses as we went, and we interviewed them about not just about the impact and the how it changed their business, but also about the processes that they went through and how they could be changed. So it was a bit of a process and impact evaluation, and also it helped us design the monitoring from that. I mean, I suppose the only thing that actually and I was in the meeting this morning, that is interesting for us in the West Midlands is we've got the Commonwealth Games. And we've got a huge evaluation program which is sucking up lots of other areas. So it's intertwined with the trade and investment program and the evaluation around that. So there's a lot of really good evaluation that is springing up as a result of the Commonwealth Games. Even now, you know, there's the things like visitor and surveys that can feed into that monitoring that allows us to evaluate impacts of the games in the longer term. So there's pockets of it. I think one of the problems that we do face is that nobody thinks about top slicing budget for evaluations. And then you're scrabbling about to find where you can fund them from, and that's not necessarily a local level issue. That's actually, you know, nationally they don't think about doing that, and they don't necessarily apply it down. So I think I think there's a general issue there where you've got big programs. There's probably something in there. It's a bit more reactive stuff that there's issues. Now, in terms of the employment support, I've picked up most of the reflections actually, and I think the biggest thing is the fact that you almost have, in those sorts of circumstances, you have to almost go back to the drawing board and redesign, which again, you need the skills and capacity and capability to be able to do that, and the confidence. That's the other thing. But and obviously, if you in that, although we were contracted to do it, there was a lot. So University of Birmingham was contracted to do it under WM Ready. The relationship meant that we were much more flexible, and if you'd contracted that to consultants, it might have been a bit more difficult to shift in such a big way that we had to.
Okay, so there was a question which was about whether or not we can share Rebecca's PowerPoint, which I assume she'll be okay with. So what we do, I should have maybe flagged this earlier, is we're recording this. So we'll actually put the recording of the event, the video, up on the website. So normally it manages to go out within kind of 2 or 3 days of the event, so hopefully by early next week. So obviously, you know, PowerPoint's embedded into the video. If you'd actually just like a version of it as PowerPoint, just drop me an email and I can send it on to you. So the next question is for Dimitri. Dimitri, are you still here? Would you like to unmute yourself and you can ask the question? Because I'm sure you can communicate it much better to Beck than I can.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for very interesting presentations. Actually, it's I admired the way you did that in West Midlands compared to what I have seen here around. And one of my questions would be that we could identify a possible marker for monitoring change in economic activities, as for example, the degree of digital transformation of businesses at local level, although I know it's quite difficult to monitor. And this could be broken down in different indicators, including how the public responds to these changes, because you don't, of course, expect you know, the only thing that happens from the business side, but also how people respond to these changes, because people are normally quite slow to respond and to change behavior. And I was wondering if whether you had any changes, such experience in West Midlands. Thank you.
In the state of the region, we have the way we group the state of the region is we use the SDG goals and look at indicators on each goal. And one of the ones that we did look at was sort of broadband and also sort of the take up and use of digital. And one of the things that we saw actually between the two state of the region reports, because you don't really have the rapid release type data that would have been helpful, but we did see it's a bit weird in the West Midlands in that there's been an awful lot of investment in broadband and then there was no take up, especially in the Black Country, and that's partly potentially due to the sectoral mix. But what we did see over the two state of the regions was actually that take up of digital activity really accelerate and change. So something has happened there And obviously you'd need more qualitative research to actually look at what businesses were doing. But then what you can see is that the latest data on the economy is that we've seen significant shifts in the manufacturing sector, and a bigger shift to digital and take-up of technology, which qualitative data that was coming through was interesting, because we were hearing from business advisory bodies that actually manufacturing all of a sudden was seeing the benefits of it, and it was having an effect. But obviously that's a long-term thing that we would have to monitor. But we did see it coming through in the yearly data, even within this timescale.
I'd flag two things on that, Dimitri, which I think are interesting to look at. So Anna Valero at the Centre for Economic Performance is doing some survey work through the working with the CBI, which is looking at a whole range of ways in which firms are responding in terms of digital and adopting other processes in response to the crisis. I'm sure that others are doing work in this space as well. I think I've seen the Enterprise Research Centre doing some stuff on, particularly on smaller firms and their responses. So I think there's a range of stuff. The thing I would say is that I think getting the local is really hard, because all of those, everyone that I know is basically having to do bespoke surveys on this, and of course then the sampling frame of the surveys makes it very difficult to get down to smaller spatial scales. But I definitely think there's something there that's interesting in telling us about what the response should be. And the other thing I should flag is the work that the Office for National Statistics and Paul Mizzen and others have been doing on attitudes to working from home, which again I think is really useful for sort of seeing what firms and workers are thinking. I mean, the thing that really emerges from that is how far apart firms' preferences are from workers' preferences, which I think is, going to be a big area for us thinking about how we can bring those two together. But again, I've got a feeling that even there, the sort of sampling frames are such that getting down and looking at subnational level is a step too far at the moment. So it's really only picking up what those national trends are. Of course, that doesn't mean you can't do anything. I mean, Rebecca sort of hinted at the fact that, to the extent that they do allow some sectoral breakdown, if you know what the structure of your local area looks like, you can work a little bit from the national differences across sectoral response, etc., down to the local level, which I think is going to be hugely valuable. But it doesn't quite get down to whether there's something specific about the way the West Mids is reacting, specifically about the way London is reacting. But I think those are two pretty useful resources.
Just on that, just pick up on that, because I would agree completely, Henry. And one of the problems I've got, and I went out of economic development and came back, is there's been a vast reduction in the quality of data that allows you to do a local analysis in the last 10 years, and that means that you're always doing workarounds, and that might mean commissioning your own work, and then you've got no way of benchmarking. So the problem is what is good? Are you doing well? Are you doing better than other places? And it does become a real problem.
Yeah, and funnily enough, our next question is on that very thing. I should, just before we move on, I'm really conscious, I was in an event that ONS ran about a month ago, and one of the things that they talked about that was what they were doing to rejig the surveys that they did around businesses and their digital capabilities. So I think there's probably stuff coming from ONS, at some point over, coming months on that as well. Sarah Hughes, would you like to come in? Because I feel like your question ties very nicely into Beck's last point that she made.
Thanks. Yeah, I think you've just started to answer the question that I'd asked, actually. My question was around the fact that the organisation that I work for, the team that I'm in, we tend to focus on very small place-based projects. And we've always struggled hugely with getting the data that we need for monitoring and evaluation. So much of the stuff that would be useful to us just isn't available at that really local level. And one of the things that we'd started talking about more recently, given the fact that, you know, the small amount of data that was out there is now going to be even more difficult to get hold of because of, you know, problems related to COVID. Do we change tack a bit, and do we actually start looking at more qualitative data gathering? And that's a whole new world for us. You know, we're a little bit unsure of how to dip our toe in that particular pond, really. And I know that's probably a really big question in itself, but it just might be worth a few pointers, I think, if you've got any, about where we could start with those kind of things.
That's good. I'll let Rebecca go first, and then I've got a couple.
I suppose so. In sort of our combined team within the West Midlands, we've got mixed methods. So we've got people that can focus on either, and we've got many academics that work in both realms. I mean, I would always recommend a mixed methods approach anyway, because they get different information for different purposes. But I think obviously the qualitative stuff, your main problem then is cost, and if you can afford to do it, but it does enable you to have more detailed understanding, especially when it's really hyper local. We did a program, or we were part of a program in the West Midlands, which actually trained local community to be researchers. And that was quite effective, and they become an asset that you can use for the research in the future. And we did a bit of the training for them on in terms of, you know, how do you present a survey, etc. So I think you have to get a bit more creative when the data doesn't exist. That's the problem.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm very sympathetic on this. So Sarah, I'd say three things, I think. So firstly, I think there are innovative sources of data which might give us some quant data to work with. I think it depends exactly on the nature of the sort of interventions that you're talking about, whether that's a feasible route. I think the second thing is we do have lots of administrative data in this country that is basically recorded by postcode. So, for example, you know, we can HMRC know what happens to employment at the postcode level for any business that is VAT registered. The trouble is that it makes it very, very difficult for anyone to access that data, and it comes with a time lag. So I think, you know, the time lag they can't do anything about. Well, although, I mean, the time lag is in them basically making that data in a way that they could hand over to a research community to do something about. You know, I think they could do much better on making the postcode data available. It's a bit back to Rebecca's point, which is that if anything, we've gone backwards there. When I started on this stuff 10 years ago, I could access sort of detailed information at the postcode level. And HMRC have now decided that that will no longer happen, that you need to, that they'll strip out the last 3 digits of the postcode. And that makes it terribly problematic to do anything at a small spatial scale. I mean, it messes up evaluations of enterprise zones. It makes sort of evaluation of local transport majors and other things more difficult. It's deeply frustrating because I think the secure environments give enough protection that you should be able to do these things without it being disclosive. That won't solve the time problem, but it would at least solve the other thing. And the third thing I was going to say was, you know, if you ever wanted to discuss that kind of stuff, we have people that can give you advice on it. So I think, you know, if you're struggling with accessing quant data for your small place-based projects, get in contact with Victoria and we'll see if there are members of our evaluation panel that can support you on it.
Absolutely. And I mean, I encourage people to do that, you know, for if you're thinking about evaluation and there's something where you think we can support or our evaluation panel can support, you know, it doesn't need to be about this specific query. Give us a shout and, we'll take a look at it and figure out, how best to support you.
It's free, by the way.
Yes,
I should say that. That's not a marketing thing. It's all pro bono. So, if you're struggling, contact us. That goes for not just you, Sarah, but everyone. And we will do our best to help, particularly on the quantitative side.
I mean, the other thing I would add, and this is very similar to the last thing I added actually, which is ONS has a new team which is looking at sub-national analysis. So because they're talking to government a lot around, around towns and high streets, and that's helping shape their thinking. So I feel like ONS are very much thinking at the moment about what have they got as data sources that they could perhaps make available at lower geographies than they currently are available. So I know that's an area of their work. And I think they're planning to publish their subnational strategy at some point in the next month or so. So keep an eye out for that. Jeff George, are you still here? Would you like to come in and ask your question? Jeff, if you're here, can you unmute yourself?
How's that?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Go on, Jeff.
Hi guys, thank you. Sorry, thanks for your patience. Thanks, Henry and Rebecca. Yeah, thank you. I was just reflecting on my question to Victoria about the fact that you've nicely eloquently stated that there is a need for us to be really understanding of the intimate understanding, if you like, of our economic trends in our locality. So the issues that are facing us through the usual statistics. And then the other dynamic, which you've nicely played out, thanks Rebecca, in your example there, is being really specific in terms of the assessment of individual projects and programs. What we've wrestled with, and certainly I've wrestled with over my career, and I've been challenged about this occasionally as we go, is how do you demonstrate that the benefits and the impact of your individual projects and programs are thence having a really significant impact on the bigger economic picture? And it's a huge question, apologies, but I think it's the kind of dynamic around actually demonstrating that what you're doing has a value and has an impact in the bigger scope of things. So apologies, huge question, but I welcome your views on how you might see that.
Well, I have strong views, but I don't know whether Rebecca wants to give her views first. I actually think it is unreasonable to expect any local evaluation to I think it's unreasonable to expect any local impact evaluation to be able to point to really substantial impacts at the level of the local economy. I think it's just unreasonable to ask it, to be honest. And it's something that I repeatedly say to government. Things that just sort of say, we we uplifted GDP by 0.5 percentage point. I mean, it's partly that I just don't believe it. It's secondly that we never spend money at those spatial scales. So my advice is always to focus on, did it change? Did it achieve the outcomes that it thought it would? Like you put together a logic model that says, I think this is going to translate through. Do I think that it translated into the outcomes that I thought the program was trying to impact? I then think it is reasonable to have an informed discussion about the extent to which that might be at the expense of other, say, unsupported local firms. So whether there is displacement, or the extent to which that might have generated multiplier impacts for non-supported firms. And again, we have a couple of toolkits that talk through how you would do it. And I stop there. I just think we waste a lot of time and effort asking places to demonstrate the aggregate impact when the aggregate impact is just impossible. Now, it's slightly different if you are national government spending large amounts of money, so I do think it might be reasonable to ask whether HS2 has, an aggregate impact. When we're spending £100 billion, that starts to be in my territory of like, I better be able to pick that up. in the aggregate data. But when we're, for most of the schemes that people on this call will be talking about, the spend is just too low. The one final thing I'd say on this, because Rebecca might have some thoughts as well, is, of course, actually, ironically, the scale of spending on COVID is such that for the first time, it might be such that we could pick up some of these sort of impacts at the aggregate scale, because I suspect that those things really have shifted what has happened in the local economy. But of course, the local economy will have been so battered by COVID and Brexit that there's no way that we'll ever be able to attribute it. So ironically, for the first time, I think we've sort of channeled money out that really might be able to be picked up at the aggregate level. But there's just too much going on to ever have any confidence in what we did. So I'm much more sort of at the level that Rebecca was at in the comments that she said. The example she gave was, what did it do for the firms we'd supported in the Pivot and Prosper? And what has it done for the families we supported in the employment support pilot? I think that is the right level at which to be answering these questions. I mean, sorry, Jeff, it doesn't do any help when you will then have people still putting that challenge back to you. All I can say is, at least there's something to say, which is that I just think it's completely unreasonable. And we do say that in quite a few of the resources, etc., that we've got online. So, if you're looking to point someone to something independent that really says, look, in most circumstances, being asked to say stuff about sort of overall impacts at the local level is pretty impossible.
That's really helpful, Henry. Thank you. Apologies, I didn't want to presume you didn't want to say anything as well, Rebecca, but I think certainly from our point of view, I think that's really helpful. A, I'm going to stick you in front of some of our bosses, thank you. And B, but more seriously, I think the kind of dynamic is exactly as I replay it, which is that the impact and the effect that individual projects can have on businesses, programs, quality of life, families, you name it, is measurable both quantitatively and qualitatively. That kind of reaction and feedback, I think that's absolutely right. So yeah, cool. Thanks, Henry.
I agree with everything that Henry's just said, but just sort of some context, and I have the same struggle you have. I seem to spend my life modelling GVA impacts of a particular programme. First of all, I'm not a big fan of GVA, but let's not go there. But and what seems to happen an awful lot of the time is that people put an awful lot of energy into those outcome indicators, GVA, skills, whatever, at that really high level, and they don't put the effort into the outputs. What are you actually going to do? And that's the important thing. And it's exactly what Henry says, at that local level, that's what you've got to focus on, and that's the important thing. How many people have you helped? How many businesses have you helped? And actually, you have to make a link to those bigger changes. But the reality is, global, energy prices now is going to whack so much through the costs and prices issue, then a lot of programs would be able to counteract. I suppose the interesting thing, Henry, would be is if there are big national programs like the furlough scheme, etc., that we could look at in the longer term and say, actually, did it really help and how did it help? Because it's that sort of level that you can do and look at the local level. One thing I would say is that when the Green Book was being written and we commented on as the Green Book user group commented on the place bit, the place analysis, one of the things that I made sure went loud and clear into that document is that central government has to do place impacts, or it has to say why it isn't. Because I think one of the problems that we do have at local level is understanding how these large programs actually affect us. And that's a problem in the sort of the analysis and the impact assessment that's done within business cases that needs to be addressed at the national level.
Yeah, I don't know how many more questions we got, Victoria, but I will say just on that quickly, I really think that central government, that there are things which make sense to evaluate at the local level, revenue type funded things which support a reasonably large number of employment, workers or firms, where I think we can, as soon as you get up to capital, I think that most of the capital spend needs central government coordinating with local areas to help a set of local areas, think about the spend. I think it's almost impossible to do at the local level. So what I have in mind there is things that look like the gateway reviews that were done for, you know, coordinating capital spend, where local areas were sort of coordinated with central government. I think doing capital spend at the local level is almost impossible, to be honest, because, you know, often you're building one scheme, and, you know, we need to look across a sort of set of, you know, so I think that you can evaluate, say, local major spend, but I think you can evaluate that by looking at the 100 schemes that were done through local majors, possibly in collaboration with the places where that local major spend occurred. I think it's very difficult to do impact evaluation if you are the recipient of one local major scheme or one towns fund scheme or one whatever at the local level, because what's the comparison? It's just almost impossible.
So I'm conscious of time. We actually only have one more question to get through, and it's a question for Henry. So it's from Jonathan Hall. So Jonathan, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question? If you're still here.
Yeah, all right, yeah. So the usual sort of problem. A question for Henry. You mentioned data sources from HMRC that have been withdrawn. I'm just interested to know what data sets were previously available, because I use BRES data quite a lot, and I gather that's based on sort of real-time information on sort of tax, sort of pay-as-you-earn tax, whatever, and things like that. I'm just interested to know what data sets were withdrawn, and could you make a case for ONS to perhaps reinstate them? So I think BRES has limitations. That's the only one that's available, but
yeah. So because withdrawn isn't fair. What happened was that there were data sets which used to be available with a full postcode, where they've now said, well, you know, Alice's postcode is WC2A2AE, so putting the 2AE in is too disclosive. And that's left an ONS, you know, have then been left, they've done a great effort with trying to map that down to output areas, for example. Yeah. Happens is that, you know, if you use WC2A, LSE might well be, you're unsure which of two output areas it is in. Suddenly, you know, you end up with with these things between. So, you know, what I think ONS is sort of actually sympathetic to it. It's that HMRC are not always as, I'm treading carefully here. HMRC, you know, have to share their data for improving basically tax or revenue collection, right? I mean, that is that they've always claimed that's the basis on which they share it. And this is one of these where, with a slightly more liberal interpretation of that, you could make that data available. But, you know, there are discussions ongoing about whether that liberal interpretation is fair. So I think, you know, you can certainly get employment and revenue spend at the very micro level. HMRC will know that. I mean, let's face it, they can do it at the individual level for all of us. I'm not necessarily suggesting that comes with another set of problems, I think, over and above the firm data. We're trying, and ONS are very collaborative on this, and HMRC is not a monolithic organisation. There are plenty of people in there in HMRC who support more, you know, open access to their data. But you know, it's an ongoing discussion. If anyone is interested, particularly in picking up on them, again, I'd just suggest they contact me. I'm always happy to advise people on that, or members of our evaluation panel can.
But I mean, I'm probably not interested in going down to the individual firm level, but certainly at a level above that would be useful.
Great, get in contact. I can give you pointers.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I promised that we would try to finish at 1:45, 13 minutes to, so we've not done too badly. So just to round up, first of all, can I thank Rebecca for coming and talking to us and sharing West Midlands experience. As always, you spoke brilliantly, and I just think there's so much other places can learn from you. And also Henry, for speaking as well, and everybody for you know raising your questions. But I kind of feel like lots of your questions were not just questions, but reflections on the challenges that we're all facing in terms of doing this. So I think that always makes it a more vibrant and engaging session. If we'd had more time, or if we'd had less questions, I guess, the question that I was going to ask the audience was, what challenges are you facing? Because I suppose one of the things we're always doing is thinking about what can we do to support local policymakers, you know, but I appreciate that it's kind of challenging to raise what your challenge, you know, what challenges you're facing in a public forum. So if anyone is, you know, facing particular challenges in monitoring and evaluation, I'd always be really interested in hearing about them, because they help shape, you know, what we put together as, you know, products and services to support, and some of them might be things that the evaluation can support. So, you know, do get in touch. I'm always interested to hear from people. The one other thing that I would flag is that the video for this event will go up onto our website in hopefully at some point in the next few days. And then our next event is thinking about businesses and how to support them through the recovery. And it's on the 18th of November. So what I've done is I have put a link in the chat that takes you to a place where both the videos live, and also the link for signing up for the next session if you would like to attend it.